On the Locked On Blues podcast, you are about to watch part 1 of the crossover episode with Locked On Wild. I recorded for over an hour with Seth over at Locked On Wild. We had a lot of fun, produced a lot of content, so we decided let's split it up into 2 parts. So today you're watching, or listening to, I should say, part 1 of the episode. We talked about the Blues offseason and the Wild offseason. And then tomorrow will be part 2, where we talked about the Central Division as a whole and gave some predictions there. Had a lot of fun. Make sure you check Seth out. He works so hard over there on that podcast. He made this all possible. Without further ado, hope you guys enjoy and stay tuned for future episodes.
You're Locked On Blues, your daily podcast on the St. Louis Blues. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a special crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Blues, part of the Locked On Sports Podcast Network. Thank you for making each show your first listen each and every day. And just as a reminder, both Locked On Wild and Locked On Blues are available wherever you listen free of charge. Not a penny to listen to each of these elite shows. On today's crossover, we'll recap the offseason for both the Blues and the Wild, and we'll turn our sights towards the season with both teams expected to be fighting for a top spot in the Central Division. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild. I'm joined by the host of Locked On Blues, Josh Hyman. Josh, no hard feelings from what you guys did to the Wild in the playoffs last year. We're turning the page, and eventful offseason for both teams. So we'll just start with the Blues since it's been a while since we've had a chance to chat. We've seen a couple of extensions given out. Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou, identical numbers. And honestly, as we'll talk about later, I'm a huge fan of both players. So I'll ask you right off the bat, which contract do you think is going to play out better for the Blues over the duration? Is it the Thomas contract or is it the Kyrou extension?
You can't do that to me. You can't make me pick my favorite child. Okay. Instead of answering that outright, I'm going to give the diplomatic media trade to answer and say, here's why each contract could play out better. Robert Thomas has a higher floor and a lower ceiling. Jordan Kyrou has a lower floor but a higher ceiling. If you ask me like, oh, which one do I think has a higher chance of being a great contract, I would say Robert Thomas. Which one has a better chance of being a steal of a contract? Jordan Kyrou. Jordan Kyrou has had incredible linear progression in his game from rookie year to now. He went from a point every 4 games to a point every 3 games to a point every other game to last season being up over a point per game, all-star fastest skater. He has grown at a rapid pace, and if he continues to grow at that pace, the sky is the limit for him. He could truly be a 100-point player in this league. Robert Thomas, you know what you're getting out of him. He is an extremely gifted player, extremely skilled. He has improved, obviously, a ton. He's gotten a lot of progression in his game as well, but he's had a little bit more time in the NHL. He's a little bit more experienced. He's a little bit more steady over the course of an 82-game season. He's not like Jordan Kyrou, who will break out for 10 games and go quiet for 3. So both of them have their opportunities of being the better contract. But my theory is that they're both going to end up being a great contract. You give your young guys long contracts for a lot of money, and $8 million in today's NHL isn't that much money for a superstar player. It's not. You see plenty of contracts in the double digits that teams end up enjoying and not regretting in the slightest. So I saw a lot of people like, oh, overpay, should have given him a bridge deal, but that's not a scenario that's going to happen. You got both of these guys locked up until the 2030s, which doesn't even feel like a real year, but the future is bright in St. Louis.
Yeah, and if you don't lock players up to long-term extensions when you have the opportunity, you have what happens to the Wild with Kevin Fiala. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but obviously plenty of other things to discuss. I want to go from kind of the happy news to a couple of the departures No more Ville Husso in net as he is now gone. So back to Jordan Binnington as the starter. But another big one is David Perron is not part of the team. At least I think it's Perron. It could be somebody else.
It is David Perron.
Perron is not part of the team anymore. And that was a little bit of a point of contention. He wanted to come back, but the team just didn't really have the funds to do it. Now we know that it was because they wanted to get this extension done. So which of those departures is going to be felt the most? Is it Ville Husso or is it David Perron?
I think this is an unpopular answer, but I think it's going to be Ville Husso. The Blues were fortunate enough to have 9 20 goal scorers on their roster last year. And guys like Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou are going to continue to grow. The offense of the St. Louis Blues was by far their number one asset. And as much as David Perron was important to that and was arguably their best player in the playoffs, he is a guy that I don't want to use the word replaceable because no one can replace David Perron, but his goal scoring and his offense is much more replaceable than the safety net that Jordan Binnington had. Jordan Binnington has yet to complete a full regular season workload in the NHL without having to be a backup for a chunk of that. You know, he had Ville Husso come in and perform spectacularly and play like a starter and earn himself a nice contract with another team in the offseason. And now Jordan Binnington is going to be asked to start the most games he has ever started at the NHL level. And if he doesn't do that, you got Thomas Greiss behind you. Thomas Greiss is a capable goaltender. Is he going to come in and do what Ville Husso did and become the starter and kind of almost carry you to the playoffs? Probably not. So if Jordan Binnington struggles, then the Ville Husso departure will be felt immensely. In terms of locker room aspect, I think David Perron was loved in that room. You know, he left the Blues 2 separate times and came back. One time in free agency or trade, and then another time in the expansion drafts. And he re-signed with the team both times. He loved the city of St. Louis. I have to imagine that unfortunately some of the players in the locker room weren't the biggest fans of the way that he was treated on the way out. You know, they have friends on the team. They understand it's a business, but I would like to think that might cause a little bit of tension in the locker room. But at the same time, like I said, from a pure hockey standpoint, the Blues had extremely potent offense. They're gonna be okay. I don't think there's gonna be a point where we look like, man, if only we had David Perron, we'd be in a playoff spot. But I do think there's a legitimate chance that Binnington struggles a little bit. We lean on Thomas Greiss. Thomas Greiss plays like he's expected to, which is good but not great. And we're like, man, wish we could have had Ville Husso for another season.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting because you know you're dealing with the goaltender that sparked the team to the Stanley Cup a couple of seasons ago, but as you said, hasn't had that full season workload yet. So it'll be interesting. I can definitely relate with the goaltending question marks as the Wild have a few themselves, but we have plenty more to discuss. So we'll sneak in a quick pause as we continue to break down both of the Wild and Blues offseason on today's special crossover episode of Locked on Wilds and Locked on Blues. Today's episode is brought to you by betonline.net. They are your number one source for all of your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. You can find all the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this year's full slate of games. BetOnline.net is also your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, including live betting, eScores, and esports and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite sports and events, including the final leg of the Major League Baseball season, plus MMA, boxing, golf, of course, the NHL, and the NBA also. So head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. You can find all that and more at BetOnline, where the game starts. Continuing our crossover episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues, make sure that you hit subscribe on YouTube and follow each of these shows so you don't miss out on any of the news as the offseason draws to a close. Both shows, again, free and available wherever you listen to your podcast. All right, Josh, I got a couple more questions for you. And then to finish This first of two, this will be a two-parter.
Yes, sir.
Because we could not get enough of that playoff series between these
I
two
can't
teams.
talk to you for only 20 minutes, Seth. You just leave me wanting more.
Yeah. So we're gonna do a two-parter here, but just wanted to dive into a few more Blues topics as we gear up for the start of the season. And I wanted to ask you about the Central Division. In my mind, it doesn't feel like any of the teams in the division had what you would call that move that would separate them from the rest of the division. The Avalanche saved as many players as they could, given the cap situation that they were going to be dealing with all those guys, losing Nazem Kadri and a couple of others. It seems like, the Wild, a couple of players that were traded away, couple of additions. Didn't seem like anybody had kind of that signature move of the offseason to really pull themselves into the lead, or at least fighting with the Avalanche for the top of the division. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Looking around the Central Division, I think a lot of teams kind of just stayed put. Obviously St. Louis lost David Perron, but the flip side of that is they have, young guys that I think are going to progress and fill that hole. Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou, who we briefly touched on getting those extensions. I think the expectation is that they continue to grow, continue to progress. The Blues have probably 15 forwards that I could see, maybe more, in the top 12, and 8, maybe 9 defensemen that are going to be competing for those spots as well. So I don't think the Blues really needed to do anything. I don't think there's anything available. Obviously, the Matthew Tkachuk thing, everyone was talking about that. I was talking about that. I dedicated like 15 episodes to that. But I don't know. I think Colorado is just so far above everyone else in the Central that even if the Blues were to go out and get Matthew Tkachuk, is it really going to be something that was feasible in the sense that whatever you had to give up? Look what Florida gave up. They gave up their best player and their second or third best defenseman. Like, could a team like the Blues have done that and realistically gotten better? I'm not so sure. So I think what we talked about, Wild, Blues, and Colorado, those are my top 3 in the Central. And I don't know. I think we saw enough out of St. Louis and honestly enough out of Minnesota where if the chips fall in the right direction, either one of those teams could, take Colorado to 7 games. I think the Blues could have taken Colorado to 7 games if Jordan Binnington stays healthy. I think Minnesota could have gave them a run for their money if the Blues didn't eliminate them in round 1. So I don't. Obviously, it's fun to root for big moves, but I just didn't. It just wasn't realistic last season, and the Blues have like only 13 guys under contract right up close to the cap heading into next offseason. So the team is going to be, if there's a time for big moves, it'll be next year. But right now, I'm happy with the way that the Blues offseason went. It was quiet, but I'm still psyched for this next season.
I asked you when the playoffs were getting going about Vladimir Tarasenko, and I want to mention it again because, at least from my outside perspective, it feels like maybe he's in a similar situation to where Kevin Fiala was. You now have both the extensions for Thomas and Jordan Kyrou that are on the books. What do you see the future as for Tarasenko? Can the Blues afford to get him in on a long-term deal? Does he want to stay? What's the deal?
That's the question, isn't it, Seth? That's the question that I've been talking about since the trade rumors started over a year and a half ago at this point, beginning of the previous offseason. It was he wants out, he wants to be traded versus no, he's content, he's happy. And then that casual little, I think it was Pierre LeBrun just tweeted in the midst of his offseason news dump, oh, by the way, Tarasenko still wants out. So like nobody really knows what his deal is fully. I would, if I were to go to betonline.net or .com, whatever it is these days, and I was putting money on it, I think he's in a different uniform next season, regardless of whether he wants to come back. I think in my heart of hearts that he wants a change of scenery. But I also don't even know if the Blues can afford him. Like I said, I think they have $67 million committed up against the cap next offseason, and they only got 13 guys making up that money. So not only do you need to figure out how to get O'Reilly back, with that limited amount of money. You also need to get like 9 other dudes on your roster. So if Tarasenko wants out, why, the argument is, oh, why didn't they trade him? It's like, well, you got a good window this coming season. They can be a really good team, and then you got Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou locked up for forever. Ryan O'Reilly might not even be back. I don't know. That's the thing. Doug Armstrong is a cutthroat GM. He doesn't give out loyalty contracts all that much, and it pains me to say it, but I don't know. I mean, I think the trade deadline is going to be interesting. I think maybe they can trade some guys, get rid of like Marco Scandela's contract. I've seen Torrey Krug's name be thrown around, but the St. Louis Blues at the beginning of 2023, 2024 are going to look so different to what they look like right now. I don't know who's going to be back. Even guys that are on roster, on contract now, I don't even think they're safe. And that's not me advocating for blowing up the team. I love the team right now, but just looking at it from a pure financial perspective, they literally will not be able to afford a full team next season if they don't make some trades or let some guys go to free agency. So it's going to be rocky. I could see Tarasenko come back if he has another great year and the trade rumors were overblown and stuff like that, and the team really wants him back. But that's what everyone said about David Perron. So my truthful answer is I have no clue.
Well, there's so much that can change so quickly in hockey, and I feel like the best GMs are the ones that can sense that there needs to be some changes made before it's like, oh my God, we got to do something. And so if you can jump off the boat a step early as opposed to 2 steps late, those are when moves are made and people are like, I didn't see this coming. So
people are gonna hate that take. People are gonna, oh no, they're not letting O'Reilly walk. Look at our last 2 captains. I hate to say it, I'm not a fan of these moves, but the last 2 captains, David Backes, Alex Pietrangelo, both times the fan base was convinced, oh, they'll be back, they'll 100% be back. And look what happened. I'm not saying I'm a fan of it. I'm not saying I want it to happen. But speaking of someone who has almost 500 Blues podcasts under my belt, you gotta start mentally preparing for a time when Doug Armstrong says, look, we're moving. Youth is the future. Jordan Kyrou, Robert Thomas, they're the next captain, assistant captain, maybe not in that order, but it's something that we could be looking at. And it's scary and it's exciting in the way that, like, you don't want to see it, but like, oh my God, what the heck would the team look like if they let everyone go next offseason? So I don't want to think about that now. It scares me too much.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That stuff can be dealt with at the time.
I'm sure there'll be plenty of episodes about that.
Yeah, let's just worry about that stuff when we have to. I'm sure your listeners have heard plenty about all of this that we just discussed. So let's give an opportunity for them to hear a little bit about what's gone on in Minnesota. Please. We'll flip it, and I will put myself in the hot seat for some Wild-related questions as we continue today's crossover episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues. Once again, thank you for tuning in to our crossover episode today. For your second listen, Locked on NHL podcast. Get the full lowdown of everything going on as we gear up for the start of the regular season. Locked on NHL is free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Josh. I'm in the question chair, so any Wild-related questions you have, hit me with them.
Yeah, I got right off the bat. So watching the Wild last year, watching the playoff series against the Blues, the Wild kind of struck me as a team that were one piece away. That traditional cliche, just, they just need one more, whatever it might have been. Another stud forward to play with Dollar Bill Kyrou, or a stud defenseman, or a stud goalie. And then this offseason rolls around and Fiala's gone, and now it kind of feels like they might be 2 pieces away. Do you feel like you're in the same boat where you were anticipating them sort of taking that next step, taking just that one more small step forward into contender status, and instead they took a step backwards? Because that's the kind of feeling that I've got.
No, it's valid, because you look at that Wild's nucleus of last year, and they caught fire so much, and you don't get to a franchise record in points, franchise record in goals. You don't have a player that breaks every statistical record that the franchise has ever had by accident. Like, it was a really good team, but it was one that was constructed to have that narrow window to compete before these dead cap hits from Zach Parise and Ryan Suter really reared their ugly heads. It's like one side of a hill, then a little bit of a lull. And once the buyouts are done, then this team should be well equipped with a bunch of young players that have had seasoning at the NHL level to be able to throw money at whatever problems they have to be a legit contender like they were this past season. It was a decision that Bill Guerin was very adamant about, trying to clean up the locker room chemistry. There are no shortage of stories of things that happened under the watchful eye of Ryan Suter and Zach Parise. And so that shows you how important it was to make those moves to get a more tight-knit unit, so that if you have that same nucleus, but you lose pieces from it, that everybody can band together and try to, still compete at that same level. I'm worried about a few different things for this year. Goaltending first and foremost.
I also lost Talbot. Yeah, forgot about that.
Cam Talbot no longer there, so you've got Marc-Andre Fleury, who is getting up there in age. You've also got Philip Gustafson, who does not have a whole lot of starts under his belt. He could be good. We just really don't know. So that's a huge variable. I've talked about this, and I'm not as worried about this now as I was. All the guys that had career seasons, Ryan Hartman, Matt Zuccarello, Marcus Foligno, you worry about some regression because, especially for a guy like Ryan Hartman, he had scored over 15 goals, I think, once in his career, and then he has 34. Is that sustainable? Is it not? I'm not as worried about him. A couple of those other guys, Marcus Foligno with the career high in goals, is that sustainable? It all comes down to opportunities for these guys, I think. And if they get those same level, Ryan Hartman being on a line with Kirill Kaprizov, you just are afforded a certain amount of opportunities, and he has shown that he's really good at cashing in on them. So the other part of it is needing a few players to step up and fill that void left by Kevin Fiala. If the Wild do that, if they get some good production from Matt Boldy over a full season, did really well with the 40-ish games that he played. If he plays a full season and does well, and Marco Rossi in his rookie season plays similarly to how Boldy did, they're going to be able to replicate that production on a similar pace, probably not at the same pace that they had last year. But you get to, even if all of this happens and the Wild get to a postseason series, you wonder what it's going to look like having Kirill Kaprizov and not having that second option. Granted, Kevin Fiala was very quiet in the postseason against the Blues, also very quiet against the Vegas Golden Knights. So it remains to be seen. I was very encouraged by Kirill kind of stepping up and taking control of that series despite the Wild not winning it. But
God, he was so scary in that series.
It was just
it really felt like for a minute there that he was just going to have like a all-time historic series and just will the Wild to a win. But that really felt like that.
And that's the other part of it too, is like it took that and the Wild still were not able to win the series. And so that leads me kind of to my point that I think the true window of contention for this team is going to be once these buyouts are done. We're going to get a ton of time over the next 3 years for all these young kids that the Wild have drafted that they have high hopes for to play, to get experience at the NHL level. If they pan out, then Bill Guerin's going to have a ton of guys on entry-level contracts, and he's going to be able to throw money at whatever he needs. I'm not saying this would happen, but a guy who is a free agent when the buyouts are history, well, it ends up being like $1.5 million combined. Leon Draisaitl is a free agent that offseason. So you mean to tell me that if Bill Guerin had the money to do it, and again, I would imagine Draisaitl would probably want to re-sign in Edmonton, but let's say he doesn't. He's going to have the money to do whatever he needs to do to get this team to the top. And I guarantee you that they are going to be a problem.
Well, what about, do you think that the solution is to have guys like that? Because I think the statistic is like, someone tweeted out a graphic of like 14 of the top 20 contracts in the NHL didn't make it to round 2. So do you almost get worried that, the second that the Wild have money, they're going to throw it all at one guy and you're going to see a repeat of the Suter Parise contracts? So that's the one thing that I love that Doug Armstrong shies away from is he doesn't give out those huge, like we're all freaking out about an $8 million contract. Have you seen the other contracts in the NHL that are comparable to Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou? That's nothing these days,
Well, and thankfully we will never have to worry about a 13-year contract ever again. Thanks a lot, Chuck
fair
Fletcher.
enough.
But
fair
no,
enough.
it is, and Bill Guerin, I think, has been very deliberate in not wanting to tie himself at this point to longer contracts. Like the Wild have over the last couple of years really not done anything more than, a 1 or 2 year deal for a free agent, with Cam Talbot being the exception. Because I think he wants to leave himself flexibility, because the other part of this is that at some point between now and the end of the buyouts, you're going to have to give Matt Boldy another contract, and Kirill Kaprizov is going to be near the end of his. So some of that money will be used to retain those guys, but Bill Guerin is going to have some flexibility if he needs it in order to maybe throw a 2-year deal to a guy like Leon Draisaitl or whatever you need to do. I think there are ways that he can do it without having to potentially get bitten by a long-term contract that doesn't pan out.
Right. I mean, it's not even like that doesn't pan out. I don't think anyone's out there regretting the Austin Matthews contract. I think it just puts you in such a difficult position where, the Maple Leafs are paying 3 of their forwards half the cap. It's just hard to win like that in a flat cap league. And as much as it's disappointing not having those superstars on your team, I mean, look at what the Avalanche have done with their steals of contracts. Nathan McKinnon making what does he make? He makes less than $7 million, something ridiculous like that.
It's hideous.
7.5. It's just not fair. It's not fair.
No.
But we could see a big cap jump in the next, what is it? Not next year, but the year after. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I believe it is next.
Okay. Yeah, so who knows? We could see some crazy contracts being handed out once that cap goes up.
Certainly hope so. But yeah, all in all, it's a Wild team that, they're going to give it everything they've got, but it is going to be tougher for them, I think, to really go deep unless a whole bunch of stuff works in their favor. And I'll say it again, and it's I can say it as much as I want because the point is so important. It's like there is so much of this season that hinges on goaltending. If Fleury, if the age thing for Fleury really starts to show, Jesper Wallstedt is probably not. And again, who knows? If Jesper Wallstedt is like the heir apparent and just absolutely blows the doors off of the AHL competition this year, maybe he gets a look. But if things go absolutely south with the goaltending, there's not a lot that is immediately ready if Philip Gustafsson doesn't look good. But then again, flip side, they both could look great. And then here we go. I truly have no idea what to expect from that situation.
There you go. I mean, yeah, same boat here. I think it's less drastic for the Blues. Like, they still got the offensive firepower. Like the beginning of the year last year when Binnington was struggling, they were winning games like 6-5, 7-4, stuff like that. But I don't know how sustainable that is. Are you going to have 9-20 goal scorers on your roster again? Is Ivan Barbashev going to score 25-plus goals like he did last year? Hopefully, but if he doesn't, you got to be ready for that. You can't just bank on having a historically powerful offense for the entirety of the season again. So I don't know.
It's going to be nuts. And for part 2 of our crossover, we'll dive in a little further. We'll do such things as 3 things that will help each team to make a deep run. 3 things we're concerned about, and we'll look at the rest of the division at large. So tune in for part 2 of our crossover. Now that you have finished listening to part 1 of this Locked On Wild, Locked On Blues crossover, keeping you up to date with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Sports Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.